Howdy everyone. So I was recently thinking about Robert Zemeckis because, well, isn't that what we all do in our free time? And how many of his most iconic works seem to have an affection for blending two things. The past, and a strong sense of yearning or nostalgia for it, and technology that only the future can facilitate an exploration of it with. These two things are the explicit premise of Back to the Future. They're the reason we got to see John Lennon plagiarize Forrest Gump, and they just recently brought us his latest epic here, which you can rent or stream there, in your house. Anyway, because I was thinking about this, I realized that of the 3 or so dozen films he's directed over the years, the one that came out as being his most definitive work happened to be 1988's Who Framed Roger Rabbit. And I know how strange it sounds to say that his definitive, arguably most mature movie was the one about the talking bunny, but hear me out. When I call Who Framed Roger Rabbit Zemeckis' definitive work, I really do mean his definitive work. As in, the movie that best represents everything there is to understand about his style and how he makes films. The one that, if you were to introduce someone to his overture, would make the most sense if you wanted to give them the clearest snapshot of what he's about and what his strengths and weaknesses are. Because while it isn't as enduring as Back to the Future, or as well regarded as, say, Forrest Gump, Roger Rabbit shows Zemeckis at the height of his powers, and has a healthy smattering of everything he's been known to take an interest in. It's a brazenly nostalgic picture similar to the other films I just listed. It's an absolute technical wonder as far as its visual effects go, much like here and the Polar Express. And it also includes one of his most iconic collaborators in one of their most iconic roles. No, not Tom from Hankshake, the other one. The nutty one. Christopher Lloyd. But not only does it showcase the things he's best known for, it would be plausible to think that Roger Rabbit also does many of them better and with more depth than some of his other films too. Meaning that it may not only be his definitive work, but that it could also be his definite work. Isn't language fun? Like, to get a super easy example out of the way, as well as build off of my Tom Hanks comment since I only mentioned him out of compliance to the rule of threes, Christopher Lloyd's casting in this film is arguably more interesting than Hanks appearing across Zemeckis' career. Mostly because in many of Hanks' collaborations with him, he's playing a typical Tom Hanks character. Somebody likable that we're supposed to relate to, admire, or root for. To the point where you could take dialogue from one of these movies and easily apply it to the other ones they've done together.
You gotta keep breathing, because tomorrow the sun will rise. Who knows what the tide could bring?
The furthest their collaborations ever got from this was in the Polar Express when they depicted Hanks' conductor character as someone who might throw kids off the train if they don't have a ticket, only to go and show that he's actually way too chill to ever do such a thing. Yet Christopher Lloyd's Judge Doom sticks to playing against type. Sure, you can count the number of Zemeckis features Lloyd has appeared in on one hand, and all of the ones other than this one are Doc Brown, but Doom is so far out of left field that it's compelling. You can't take your eyes off of him whenever he crops up in this, and that contrast combined with the character itself are fascinating to watch. Years later, the fact that it's an outlier remains noteworthy. Similarly, Roger Rabbit itself does more than just play the hits of what you'd expect from a Zemeckis film. It goes deeper, exposing and sidestepping one of his greatest blind spots as a filmmaker. A blind spot that many of his most beloved movies fail to adequately account for. The fact that his nostalgia for yesterday is often lensed through paper-thin fabrications of the past. Fabrications that leave some glaring omissions when it comes to how ugly or complicated their realities are, often in the name of pursuing something more heartfelt. Which isn't always a bad thing and is sometimes intentional, but does also often lead to him pointing at a different time period and going, gee whiz, wasn't life better back then? When it was in fact not. So today I figured, what the heck? Let's talk about Who Framed Roger Rabbit and the many ways it represents the Robert Zemeckis experience. I'll go over how it depicts the 1940s, how its many technical innovations foreshadow the later half of Zemeckis' career, and how the combination of both those elements led to a film that stands as one of, if not his most important and well-developed works. One that may not be perfect as far as the execution of its own ideas go, but is also the best Zemeckis ever did in regard to its subject matter. Before we continue though, if you happen to like what you're seeing so far and want to support the channel, feel free to do so by subscribing or answering the following question of the day over in the comments. What's your favorite Robert Zemeckis movie and why? Additionally, if you want to go the extra mile, you could also throw a shilling my way on Patreon or by getting a channel membership or leaving a super thanks. These videos take a long time to make, and small gestures like that go a long way in helping me get out of bed in the morning. You could also stop by my film Discord, Interior Film Discord, if you'd like to hang out and chat about flickies, the cute name for movies I just came up with and not the birds from the Sonic universe. Though maybe I'll just make a gaming channel there someday so we can chat about those guys too. A link to all of those things are in the description. I've already spoken at length about Robert Zemeckis and his love of nostalgia thanks to a previous video I made about Back to the Future, but Who Framed Roger Rabbit manages to take things to a whole other level. Right off the bat, Roger Rabbit establishes one major distinction in how it approaches nostalgia. It sticks to fiction. For comparison, Forrest Gump, Back to the Future, Here, and many other Zemeckis movies make the mistake of rooting their heavily Americana'd versions of the past in reality. A choice that kinda sets them up to fail by giving them a version of history to misrepresent or trivialize. However, that isn't as much of a problem in the case of Who Framed Roger Rabbit since it takes place on a version of Earth where cartoon characters are real. It's already harder for us to criticize its depiction of the past because it's less recognizably our past. This was a wise choice on the part of the film too, since there are still a number of parallels to our world that we can now better appreciate at face value. Because we no longer have to worry about this being our world, we're encouraged to consider why these similarities are there. Another notable trait is that the film keeps its list of nostalgic influences short, opting to pull from two hallmarks of the 1940s for its visual style and tone: animation and film noir. A medium and a genre that allows Zemeckis to get as nostalgic as he wants while keeping everything rooted in fiction, which he then uses as a springboard to actually explore something in our reality. But I'm getting ahead of myself there. For now though, let's dive into how he works with those two influences. Who Framed Roger Rabbit opens with an animated short that's done in the style of a classic post-war cartoon titled Something's Cookin'. The attention to detail in the short is jaw-dropping and sets the tone for the entire film. From the classic squash and stretch animation to Tex Avery-style humor, or the fact that a feature film is being ushered in by the exact type of short that would have preempted a movie back in the 40s. Everything feels like it was done the old-fashioned way, albeit with modern flourishes and hindsight there to help smooth things over. It's very Renaissance in its reverence for the past. And the best part about this opening short is that it ends with a seamless transition into the film proper. In a single camera movement, it tells us that what we're watching is gonna go far beyond what we signed up for, that we're going to investigate things from, and excuse the pun, another perspective. Which is all to say that, yeah, something was cooking indeed.
Someone cooked here.
You also have the fact that Roger Rabbit pulls heavily from film noir, leading to a movie that operates within the 1940s' defining genre of film and takes place during its classic period. There's nothing superficial about how it depicts the genre. It's the real deal. The film transcends the basic visual trappings of a noir, using them as a springboard for its own depth. It does more than cast scenes in chiaroscuro or Dutch angles, and it goes beyond giving us a flawed main character and an abundance of drink and sin in the world he inhabits. Roger Rabbit embraces the brutality of noir and the moral gray area that many of its stories embody. Eddie Valiant isn't just flawed, he's a depressed alcoholic who lost his brother and developed a prejudice against the people he holds responsible for his death. He's a good person with his heart in the right place, but is forced to do less than ethical work to make ends meet. The guy isn't just cynical because a ton of noir protagonists are. He's a three-dimensional character, a lost soul trapped in a would-be purgatory because he lost someone important to him.
Well, you're a sight for sore
I ain't
eyes.
seen you to nigh on to 5 years.
Where you been? Drunk.
And then there's my favorite way that Who Framed Roger Rabbit taps into noir. The way it plays with the femme fatale trope through the character of Jessica Rabbit. She may look, sound, and appear to be your standard deadly woman, but we quickly learn that this isn't true. Whereas your run-of-the-mill femme fatale is defined by several key traits, she sidesteps as many of them as possible while still appearing to be that character archetype. She's, as she tells Eddie herself, only designed to appear that way.
I'm not bad. I'm just drawn that way.
Here's a basic rundown of 5 common characteristics of a femme fatale, as listed on Backstage.com, and how Jessica Rabbit doesn't quite fit into them. Number 1, femme fatales are never the hero. This one states that though they don't necessarily have to be the villain of the story, they're usually an antagonistic force, which does appear to be the case when we meet Jessica Rabbit, but doesn't stick around for long. Her mission is the opposite of antagonistic. By coming to Eddie for help in clearing Roger's name, she proves that she's on the side of justice. Number 2, your average femme fatale is sneakily seductive. There is nothing sneaky about Jessica Rabbit. She does flirt with Eddie when she meets him in his office, but it's downplayed as a joke on account of being so cartoonish in its execution. After all, her husband even states that laughter is the reason for the existence of cartoon characters in the first place.
But I'm a toon. Toons are supposed to make people laugh.
You can also play the comedy card here by stating that Zemeckis and the film's 2 writers, Jeffrey Price and Peter S. Seaman, teehee, were leaning into the trope by making her appear especially seductive in light of Dolores walking in on them. Number 3, femme fatales are shrouded in mystery. Again, while this appears to be the case in her earlier scenes, we quickly come to learn that the only mystery Jessica has to her name is what she's doing married to Roger. A mystery that gets solved in a very matter-of-fact way sometime around the 3rd act.
Seriously, what do you see in that guy?
He makes me laugh.
So while she is initially portrayed as a person with her own agenda that runs deeper than just wanting to clear her husband's name, this was only done to mislead us and convince us that she's a traditional femme fatale that could have committed the murder herself. It's also a great riff on a popular noir storyline. A wife that's miserable or using her husband and wants out of their relationship through any means necessary, often committing or being accused of murder in the process. That's the general premise of films like Double Indemnity, The Postman Always Rings Twice, Caught, and some variation of that storyline exists in many other films. But here, it's subverted because Jessica loves her husband and is trying to help him clear his name for a murder that he was framed for. Number 4, our femme fatales are usually conventionally attractive. Just like before, there's nothing conventional about Jessica Rabbit. She's drawn to be as alluring and attractive as can be by era-specific standards, to the point of having an impossible physique and, at the admission of Zemeckis himself on the movie's commentary track, a chest that defies the laws of physics in order to accentuate it. Her design is basically the end product of a couple of horny dudes grabbing a headshot of Rita Hayworth and Gilda, bringing it to a caricature artist, and telling him to draw her.
If she was real with that teeny waist and the top and the bottom, it would just fall over. I mean, it's not possible.
And number 5, a femme fatale is deceptively dangerous. This one speaks for itself, I think. Jessica is dangerous, and deceptively so, but it's not as an antagonist as is customary in the genre. She's a woman who knows what she wants and will stop at nothing to get it, but in a more positive and sympathetic way. We end the film with an understanding that she and Roger have a healthy relationship, and that her deceptiveness was all in the name of trying to keep him safe. She's ultimately equal to her peers in the story in terms of utility. The many nuances surrounding Jessica Rabbit are kind of interesting to me, as it's pretty clear that she was intended to be viewed as a positive spin on the femme fatale trope. Yet in the years since the film's release, it's almost like the public forgot that she's a 3-dimensional character. Unfortunately, the average person is more likely to remember her for her bodily proportions, or the fact that the animators originally had her flash the camera in one scene. In an ironic twist of fate, Jessica Rabbit has become the very sex symbol that she originally commented on. The 2D character that feels tailor-made to shock viewers with how well-rounded she is has been relegated to shocking viewers with well, how well-rounded she is. It's almost like horny dudes on the internet never listened to a word she said.
I'm not bad. I'm just drawn that way.
Did you say something?
However, that doesn't stop the intent from being there. So much of this film was designed around noir as a genre that it can never be divorced from it, to the point where the film's earliest roots stem from a sequel to the neo-noir movement's most iconic film, Chinatown. Yeah, Chinatown, the seminal Roman Polanski flick that starred Jack Nicholson and Faye Dunaway. That one. The film was initially slated to be the first part of a trilogy, but when the second film got stuck in development hell, a cable car subplot from the third film was combined with the novel Who Censored Roger Rabbit and got upcycled into the movie we know and love. Coincidentally, elements of Who Censored Roger Rabbit's structure kind of reminds me of Citizen Kane, a movie that may not be film noir proper, but was certainly influential on the genre. These inspirations go a long way in broadening the depth of the material. Remnants of them exist in the film and help flesh out the world that we're being brought into. It makes everything feel authentic. Like Roger Rabbit isn't just a parody of noir, but is one and is interested in using that distinction to tell a story about Hollywood 40 years before it got made.
A story of greed, sex, and murder.
We have characters like Jessica Rabbit that represent the way that women were objectified back then. Characters like Betty Boop, who hinted how an actor's legacy means bupkis in Tinseltown, and an exploration of something that was clearly modeled after the real story of GM dismantling public transportation to make way for freeways and drive the sale of automobiles. Most important of all, there's also a full-on reference to the era's race relations through the cartoon characters as a whole, which we'll get to soon. But for now though, let's wrap this chapter up by emphasizing the way that Roger Rabbit expresses nostalgia by comparing it to some of Zemeckis' other films, specifically Forrest Gump and Here.
I'm gonna be an artist.
Oh, great. Just what the world needs. Don't be an idiot. Get a job where you wear a suit.
A quick look at both those movies reveal how empty their references can feel. More often than not, they're just kinda lip service, much like the 50s and 1800s we saw in the Back to the Future movies, something that got sprinkled into the stories so that we could lean over to a friend and do our impression of a memberberry. Remember John Lennon? Remember the Black Panthers? Remember the KKK?
I do, unfortunately.
The key difference, though, is that those Back to the Future movies were comedy adventure flicks first and foremost, while Forrest Gump and Here were shooting to be epic coming-of-age stories about America. Their tone necessitates a greater need for accuracy or something resembling nuance because they're quote-unquote supposed to be realistic. Just as how Roger Rabbit and Back to the Future can get away with taking some liberties since they're comedic, and in the case of the latter of the two, soft science fiction, the pendulum also swings the other way. Aspects of how the past gets referenced in Forrest Gump feel problematic because this is supposed to be our world. So when we see a pretty obvious stereotype or mischaracterization of a real person or thing crop up, then have zero nuance or acknowledgement that it's offensive or in poor taste, we're naturally bothered by it. It's basically the exact opposite of how things played out in Roger Rabbit, where things were veiled behind a clearer wall of fiction and got used to play at something greater. Zemeckis' unwillingness to engage with difficult elements about the past while simultaneously bringing them up in the first place is genuinely frustrating, and that's a sentiment that I'm far from alone in feeling. Aside from the fact that Broey Deschanel did an excellent video talking about something similar in regards to Forrest Gump last year, there are also numerous articles and blog posts on the subject. Heck, even guys like Spike Lee have weighed in on it. Here's a snippet from his 1995 Criterion commentary for Do the Right Thing, where he shares his thoughts on Zemeckis' handling of black culture and how he believes it's historical revisionism.
Another thing that disturbs me is this revisionist history. How white America's tried to just change stuff. Like, two examples, Robert Zemeckis in Back to the Future. Michael J. Fox's character came with the duck walk and not Chuck Berry. And now Forrest Gump is this crippled kid who thought Elvis Presley.
That commentary may have been recorded 30 years ago, but it's still pretty accurate. At best, Zemeckis has only gone from committing historical revisionism to referencing history, even just contemporary history, in a disinterested way. Take this sequence from his latest film here, for instance. It's a brief vignette where a father sits his son down and tells him what to do in the event of getting pulled over by a police officer, which does succeed in making you feel something and is socially conscious, but also doesn't say much either. There is some depth that gets added to it when you consider the other scenes of that family in the film and how out of left field this one moment is, but the statement still comes across as matter-of-fact and unlived in, like it's being read off of an essay as opposed to explored in a dramatic scene. You don't even have to view this movie under a racial lens to see its shortcomings in depicting uncomfortable realities. There's a funeral sequence that takes place during the flu pandemic in the 20th century that's equally nonchalant. Zemeckis is pretty clearly drawing a parallel between the flu pandemic that followed World War I and our own COVID pandemic, but it's also done with the tone of a conversation from King of the Hill, so it hardly makes you feel anything.
Yep.
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 A problem that does date back to Forrest Gump too, because by having Forrest witness so many iconic moments from the 20th century, you're primed to expect some sort of grand statement about them. Yet, time and time again, the most we get is a shallow or naive comment.
A few years later, that angry little man at the schoolhouse door thought it'd be a good idea and ran for president. But somebody thought that it wasn't. For no particular reason, somebody shot that nice young president when he was riding in his car. And a few years after that, somebody shot his little brother too, only he was in a hotel kitchen. Some years later, that nice young man from England was on his way home to see his little boy and was signing some autographs for no particular reason at all. Somebody shot him.
While I was researching this video, I stumbled across an article that Film School Rejects published in 2015 about Robert Zemeckis' then latest film, The Walk, and I found that author Christopher Campbell said something that really tugged at the heart of how Zemeckis' use of the past usually makes me feel. Campbell says, "The Walk isn't quite as successful as the documentary version of Patis's story, Man on Wire, as far as making us yearn for the more innocent times before the terrorists attacked those Twin Towers. But coming from the co-writer and director of Back to the Future, it's hard not to see a parallel between Zemeckis' nostalgia for the 1950s and his sentimental tribute via Patis to the 30-plus years those towers existed." There are two words in that really stood out to me as being Zemeckis' entire shtick, because a lot of his recreations of the past aren't the full story. They're a sentimental tribute. A tribute that, when applied on a larger scale, sheds important context and depth in favor of familiarity and warmth. A problem that isn't applicable to Roger Rabbit since it's so obviously fictitious. If one of the main problems that myself and a lot of other fans of Zemeckis have with his work is that it often leans into yesterday in an overly shallow way, Roger Rabbit does everything needed to avoid that problem. Because the film's nostalgia is more for noir and animation than the actual 40s itself, and the film goes out of its way to be surprisingly authentic to both those things, it's largely free of that criticism. This isn't a knock on his ability to direct drama or more cerebral films, because I think a lot of his other work ranges from watchable to great. For example, I recently saw Contact, and while it's no 2001: A Space Odyssey or Close Encounters, I liked it. And I also ended up checking out The Walk after reading about it and thought that it was pretty good too. It's just that I keep returning to Roger Rabbit as being the best example of his wheelhouse as a filmmaker. And I think a huge part of why that's the case for me is because it feels like the Rosetta Stone for everything that was to come from him. Like how we can see it start to turn him into a special effects guy. This is probably going to be a short chapter on account of the script already starting to get away from me, and because a lot of this is both well documented elsewhere and relatively common knowledge. Basically, Who Framed Roger Rabbit is a technical masterpiece. It's got top-notch compositing, puppetry, performances that bridge the gap between them, all of it. It's Roger frickin' Rabbit. You'll believe a rabbit can't hold his liquor. The film necessitated more than the usual parlor tricks Disney had been using since the days of Mary Poppins. They needed modern technology to make things appear as seamless and realistic as possible, without also being forced to clamp down on Zemeckis and cinematographer Dean Cundey's creative expression. The film called for motion control cameras, animators that were skilled enough to place characters in moving shots without the assistance of modern motion tracking, technicians at ILM that could animate multiple layers of lighting to have them blend into a scene more realistically. It took the best in the trade to make this movie happen. People with the time, talent, and patience to draw Dumbo flying behind pulled shades and not make it look uncanny. And aside from the odd flub that you'll see once, then never frickin' unsee, they totally pulled it off. One can only imagine that post-production on Who Framed Roger Rabbit was grueling. It took 14 months to complete post on it, which is a very long time for a live-action movie, and every second of that work shows in the final product. So yeah, kudos to Robert Zemeckis for having the patience to do all of that, and good on him for doing such a great job of it. The guy's clearly got an eye for directing this sort of film, and you'll love to see someone discover that about themselves while undertaking a massive challenge. And discover that he had, by the way, because there was a notable uptick in more complicated special effects work in his movies following Roger Rabbit. There's all the motion control shots in his 2 Back to the Future sequels, all of the CGI effects in Death Becomes Her, the archival footage trickery in Forrest Gump, his thing for CGI Christmas movies in the mid-2000s, and the real-time de-aging effect that was used in here, to name a few notable examples. To the point where, somewhere down the line, his embrace of new technologies became the thing I would hear people talk about whenever his name came up. For example, it was the main hook of Here's marketing. You've seen Tom Hanks and Robin Wright grow up together in Forrest Gump, and now you get to see it happen all over again thanks to AI. And while that was admittedly kinda neat and I didn't entirely hate it, it's telling that without the gimmick, the film is more or less just, what if the Tree of Life was a stage play and nowhere near as impactful? This is all basically a milder version of the George Lucas effect. When a filmmaker who shows some serious potential hits it big making a technically inventive or complicated film, then proceeds to let that grow to define his approach to filmmaking. Lucas showed incredible promise in telling humanistic and politically aware stories in American Graffiti and THX 1138. He then hit it big with Star Wars, which leans more human than political, but proceeded to mostly lose the ball on the films he directed afterward. Sure, there were still glimmers of brilliance and good ideas to be found in his later work, but a lot of it had been lost in the shuffle of pioneering new filmmaking techniques through technology and a worse than ever urge to
make purchase of the merchandise.
Until he sold Star Wars to Disney and semi-retired. Zemeckis' career took a similar turn to Lucas's in my opinion, albeit with less pronounced extremes. He hit it big telling emotionally solid stories, then began to take on increasingly complex projects. Projects that helped codify the way that filmmakers work in the medium today. But in the process, he also appears to have lost at least some of his focus on the things that made his best films special. That said, he isn't a complete goner. Movies like Castaway show that he can still tell an efficient, emotionally driven story. Heck, Forrest Gump itself is a marvelously emotional film too, despite how artificial and surface level it can be. It's just that Zemeckis can't stop shooting himself in the foot with whatever new gizmo he's playing with, and that doing that often compounds his worst blind spot as a storyteller. Roger Rabbit is the greatest instance of him blending Olympic-level technical play with his signature nostalgia. It's a movie where, even if the screenplay didn't incorporate the shades of social commentary I've already discussed and will circle back to shortly, everything comes together. The visuals are mind-blowing in their ambition for the time, but they also get raised to the next level thanks to the fact that the film is a noir, a genre whose lighting conventions and dark subject matter would have made blending children's animations into it an even harder sell. The film doesn't skimp on camera movements or having these characters interact with their surroundings, instead trying to do it as much as possible in order to make things more complicated and impressive. Last, the film doesn't only do these things for a cheap gag or to have Dick Van Dyke dance with penguins. It does it in order to tell a straight-up hard-boiled detective story that was originally intended to be a sequel to one of the most iconic detective films of all time. Who Framed Roger Rabbit never feels like a tech demo for what movies might be able to accomplish in the coming decade. It's setting a bar for all of those other movies to try and live up to. There's an austerity in what it seeks to do and how it doesn't compromise in doing it. It needed the technology used to make good on its premise. While Forrest Gump could have avoided using so much CGI through decent casting, or The Walk could have dialed down on some of the painfully in-your-face digital camera work, Roger Rabbit would have fallen apart without its visual trickery. Much as Jar Jar Binks was once considered the key to the Phantom Menace, Roger Rabbit was the key to Zemeckis telling a complicated story about the past.
Please, don't mind me.
Which brings us to the most complex aspect of Roger Rabbit, and something I teased earlier in this video. The fact that it uses everything I've been talking about to actually say something. More impressively, given Zemeckis' track record with it, to say something about race specifically. By the way, there might be some antiquated imagery coming up, so yeah, trigger warning. I realize how that idea might make some folks' ears perk up because it's admittedly a bit out there and God forbid something get viewed under a political lens without getting smeared as being woke nonsense. So real quick, I want to play a clip from the film's commentary track that confirms that it is about race.
This scene was also the first scene where we introduced the idea that Hollywood was segregated between humans and toons, and that they had clubs that were sort of in a Harlem-like area, in the Toontown area.
Yeah, a lot of people think this movie is a cartoon. It's actually about civil rights.
But even without that total pearl of a soundbite, it pans out thematically and historically to consider Who Framed Roger Rabbit a film about race relations. It is, after all, a movie where a bunch of white folks interact with a type of person that doesn't resemble them in a pre-civil rights America. Of course it's race-coded. Roger Rabbit takes place in 1947, and while that's a long way from the peak of the civil rights movement, the 40s were still the decade that the movement began in. 1941 brought us the first threats of a March on Washington, and led to President Roosevelt banning discrimination in defense industries. The 1940s also brought about the end of segregation in the military thanks to President Truman in 1948, as well as the commissioning of a study in 1946 about racial inequalities and, as the National Park Service puts it on their website, an end to segregation in America.
A foreigner, when he comes to this country, is usually always puzzled to find that there is, to some extent, bigotry in regard to the treatment of the Negro.
Regardless of how many associate the 50s with the cry for equality toward men and women of all races, colors, and nationalities, it's not like those cries hadn't existed for some time already. Keying in on this specific part of the real America that Roger Rabbit takes some inspiration from, Hollywood, we can see that race and the treatment of minorities was a huge thing at the time there too. Especially since it's well known that animation itself has a long-running history of using racial caricature for inspiration. This example may be off by a couple of decades, but look at Damien Chazelle's film Babylon and the conversation that grew in the wake of its release if you want to see what I mean. It may be a fictionalized tale, but it's one that draws heavily from and amalgamates the lives of real people in order to depict the treatment of workers, a number of whom were minorities in Tinseltown back in the early to mid 20th century. Many of the film's characters were put through the ringer to make a name for themselves and had to put up with absolutely abysmal treatment in order to lay their stake in Hollywood before getting cast aside if they didn't already quit for themselves.
You'll need that to come back.
It's okay, I won't be back.
And this honestly isn't that different from what we see in Roger Rabbit. Betty Boop got tossed aside because she's a black and white character. Roger and Jessica were used as pawns in Maroon's scheme to get Acme to sell his warehouse. Not to mention, Roger was the subject of straight-up verbal abuse on set, and there's the general othering of animated characters to consider too. We could even look at Judge Doom a bit. His whole plot to pave paradise and put up a parking lot is basically what Amnesty International calls slum removal, or in other words, using the creation of highways as an excuse to build roadways where there were already black neighborhoods.
The federal government was a sponsor of urban renewal, infamously called Negro removal by the great James Baldwin.
Urban renewal, which means moving the Negroes out.
That so-called urban renewal
also included a federally sponsored interstate highway system, which was intentionally designed to mow through vibrant Black neighborhoods.
To quote Amnesty International's piece Roads and Race, How the Highway System Symbolizes Racial Injustice in America, the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 built out our federal interstate system. But in many instances, these roadways were built directly over the top of poorer, low-income Black and brown communities. To facilitate the creation of the interstate system, the government seized homes via eminent domain, and in some neighborhoods, completely cut them off from the rest of the city. Doom's plan is an even more twisted, vile version of the FAHA. He's so set in trying to line his pockets that he bought an election, employs gangsters to do his dirty work, and straight up concocts a dip that can kill toons, something that was previously thought to be impossible.
Remember how we always thought there wasn't a way to kill a toon? Well, Doom found a way.
And then there's also, like, his whole vaguely Nazi demeanor thing too. The guy's got generally bad vibes all around. But let's not kid ourselves here. For while Doom is our chief antagonist, he's also the end product of a bunch of issues that are systemic. Because, like I was saying before I brought him up, examples of exploitation and mistreatment of cartoon characters are everywhere. That club that Eddie goes to when he has to take pictures of Jessica Rabbit? That's clearly supposed to be the Cotton Club in Harlem, a venue that was famous in the 1930s and 40s for being the place many of the era's best Black performers would go to perform for a whites-only audience. We also have Eddie Valiant himself, who's straight up prejudiced against cartoon characters. The movie may position this as being due to his brother's death at the hands of Judge Doom, but the guy clearly has some internalized hang-ups. Plus, let's not forget that this is a Disney movie. They may have been cool throwing a bunch of problematic stuff into their movies back in the Song of the South days, and let's be real, even after Who Framed Roger Rabbit came out, but you could bet your bottom dollar that Michael Eisner's Disney wasn't gonna let a full-on racist guy be the movie's main character in 1988.
Toons.
Because of this, Valiant's negative undertones are mostly downplayed. He's more ignorant than anything, living with something akin to internalized prejudice and unaware of what guys like Roger are really like. He's more interested in keeping them out of his life whenever possible, and the most he's willing to express on the subject is basically identical to how Marty McFly handles getting called a chicken.
I don't work for toons.
Nobody calls me chicken.
Thankfully, none of that stops Valiant from having a strong arc. Thanks to his investigation and efforts to clear Roger's name, he's able to see the error in his ways and let go of the resentment he had come to foster toward the animation nation. Eddie also lightens up a bit, and we see him plant a big wet one on Roger as the ultimate payoff to his journey. The message is as clear as it gets, short of bursting into ebony and ivory. A very deliberate choice of words, might I add, since Eddie's brother got killed by a piano specifically. The racial subtext in Roger Rabbit is what really made my last rewatch of this movie such a potent experience. Noir is about cynicism, and many of these animated characters, by proxy of them being comedic constructions that we colloquially consider to be for children nowadays, are about joy. So when you put these two elements together and use the animated characters as a stand-in for minorities, you end up with the idea that diversity and inclusion are good things that can brighten up the world. Unless you're friends with Tweety, I guess. Or Xy now? I don't know, just get off Twitter. However, let's also not kid ourselves because this comparison isn't without its flaws. After all, we're talking about Robert Zemeckis. I've already given you a few examples of how he doesn't quite nail discussions of race in his work, and despite being his best take on it, Roger Rabbit is also far from perfect. For starters, you do have stuff like Jessica's backing band being the crows from Dumbo and continuing that film's leaning into them being black-coded, which is pretty bad when you consider how they reinforce stereotypes in that movie and are doing the same thing here. For Christ's sake, one of these guys is literally named Jim Crow. It's a bit uncomfortable to think about, especially since it's handled with little self-awareness or without at least winking to the audience that the move has any sort of motivation to it other than, haha, wouldn't it be funny if the crows from Dumbo, who were explicitly written as black, were also jazz musicians? The metaphor for cartoon characters being minorities was strong enough as is. Putting the crows in as these characters doesn't do anything to add to it. It comes across as tone-deaf self-indulgence, much like the film's decision to include a Native American bullet that's also pretty damn offensive, or having a gorilla work the doors at the Ink and Paint Club despite the long history of gorillas and apes being used to depict people of African descent in popular culture.
Booga booga!
Similarly, while I do kind of like the idea of Toontown being diverse thanks to many characters of different shapes, sizes, and studios cohabitating in there, let's not forget that the place is also extremely chaotic and full of violence. The idea may seem fine when you look at it on a surface level, but it quickly falls apart when you try to engage with it on the level that the emotions in the film itself wants you to. Eddie mentioned that his brother and him used to like working in Toontown because it felt exciting. And that has this icky otheringness to it when you consider the fact that he's talking about what the film's logic positions as an ethnic neighborhood. That said, you could argue that these imperfections are more of a feature than a bug. For better or for worse, the approach to the commentary does encourage you to acknowledge how troubling it is. And once you do that, you're able to take a step back and recognize the way their real-life inspirations are equally troubling. Take my earlier comment about the Ink and Paint Club being an obvious riff on the Cotton Club. A lot of viewers might be uncomfortable with how sexualized Jessica Rabbit was during her performance, and consider it a bit inappropriate for there to be a quote-unquote humans-only venue where cartoon characters maim and sexualize themselves for human enjoyment. However, that does admittedly force us to consider how the Cotton Club wasn't that different back in its heyday. Eddie's motivation for hating animation creations is similar. It's befuddling, and once you stop to think about it, a bit loony for him to have gone from 0 to 100 on the all tunes or bad tunes spectrum as fast as he did. All it really does is leave the implication that he may have always held these feelings in his heart, even when he and his brother were loved by the community. He may not have been outward about them, or even consciously aware that he felt that way, but one thing the movie does repeatedly show us is that he has a limited understanding of tune logic.
No tune can resist the old shave and a haircut.
I don't know who's tuning you. You are doomed. Roger.
The thing that makes these nuances work for me more than they don't is that they're there at all and that they aren't hidden under that much subtext. The seediness of the Ink and Paint Club is the point of Eddie's entire pit stop there. He visited it to take lurid pictures of Jessica Rabbit. Likewise, his disdain for guys like Roger is depicted as being something of an outlier amongst the circles he walks within. He's also transparently an alcoholic, which helps underline the irrationality of his feelings because, while some may call liquor a reliable truth serum, few would consider a blathering drunk to be particularly eloquent or logical in their approach to spewing said personal truth. Now, I would have preferred if they went a bit deeper with the metaphor they built up, perhaps in the same way that Pixar's Zootopia would decades later, but I do appreciate the effort here, and I do generally think that the writers in Zemeckis' heart were in the right place. Like, let's not pretend that this movie isn't nearly 40 years old and that it wasn't fairly ahead of its time for handling things this well in the first place. This came out 2 years after frickin' Soul Man, guys. A movie where a guy does blackface to get a scholarship and James Earl Jones commends him for it.
But you've learned something that I can't teach them. You've learned what it feels like to be black.
No, sir.
Beg your pardon?
I don't really know what it feels like, sir. If I didn't like it, I could always get out.
You've learned a great deal more than I thought.
Who Framed Roger Rabbit is the defining film of Zemeckis' career because it was a perfect fit for his skill set as a storyteller. Fresh off the success of Back to the Future and Romancing the Stone, another film that expresses nostalgia for the past if you view it as a send-up to 1930s and 40s romance and adventure films, he was quickly becoming the guy to hire if you wanted to do a send-up to the past. Add to that his knack for working with special effects in mind and a screenplay with a bit of nuance to it, and you've got a match made in heaven. Zemeckis' touch on this film takes the apparently highfalutin concept that people of different ethnicities or genders are deserving of your respect and admiration, and literalizes it by having those aforementioned people actually be different from us. Because the, and no pun intended here, I swear, integration of animated elements and live action ones are done so well, we're shown that these two types of people have equal footing in the world. Things feel organic and like everyone belongs here. And just as I've stated before, the fact that this is so clearly a fictional work makes the rough spots of Zemeckis' approach or the occasional messiness of the metaphor itself go down easier. It reminds you to suspend your disbelief a bit and focus on the meaning of the film as opposed to every nook and cranny of the execution. It's about, and this time I do intend the pun, the big picture. Because similar to how the film does have its fair share of technical hiccups, those gripes aren't the end-all be-all of what they're trying to do. Roger Rabbit's main objective still gets fulfilled at the end of the day. It's still a fun comedic adventure with a message, and the film largely sells the illusion that these characters are really there and that we should personify them because of it. These characters have literal and figurative depth, which affords Who Framed Roger Rabbit some literal and figurative depth of its own. The whole point of the movie is that things aren't as clear-cut as they seem to be. Roger isn't the murderer he's been painted out to be. Jessica isn't the femme fatale she was drawn to be. And Eddie isn't as much of a hard-boiled, jaded detective as everyone thought he became after his brother died. It's almost fitting that Zemeckis' best job of handling questions pertaining to race and handling nostalgia in general is in this movie specifically. Roger Rabbit really does feel like a film that was tailor-made for everything he brings to the table. It's almost a sick punchline, too. What was arguably his most complex and mature movie happened to be the one about the cartoon rabbit. It's because of this that I can't help but view Who Framed Roger Rabbit as the definitive Robert Zemeckis film. Not my favorite by a long shot because I'll live and die a Back to the Future guy, but a movie that has everything you need to know about him and what he's capable of on display for you. It's got his love for complex visual and special effects, a surprisingly human story, core considerations toward depicting history and race, all of it. For better or for worse, it's a crash course on his career and would make for a hell of a starting point for anyone that's looking to dive into it. Anyway, that brings us to the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and that if you did, you consider leaving a like or subscribing if you haven't already, or just answering the question of the day. Additionally, you could check me out on Patreon, or get a channel membership, or leave a super thanks if you really want to go the extra mile. You're also welcome to check out my Discord, Interior Film Discord, or my two podcasts, Media Obscura and Glaring Admissions. If you got this far into the video and you happen to enjoy movie and TV podcasts, there's a good chance you'll dig those two too. Two. So yeah, bye.